Hi, good morning, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here in this room today and on this panel with amazing leaders, and in this room with really passionate women leaders and men. We are going to be talking about youth. We've been hearing a lot about youth yesterday, and especially about, how the scale back on their perception on gender equality, at least in the countries, where the index measured. So that's something of huge concern. So we are going to be talking about rethinking the rules. Really looking at how deeply ingrained gender norms are changing and influencing perceptions of young people, how they view themselves, how they really look at society, how they really perceive what they can be, who they can be, what they can dream that they can do based on how society looks at them, based on their sex, how they perceive other gender. So really important to sort of rethink how we are framing this for young people today, and what are some of the evidence-based approaches or methodologies that have really sort of helped, in this space. So we're going to do that today. And also, it is really important because we all know, neuroscience tells us, psychology tells us that adolescent is extremely critical age in human development, where we can really sort of build their minds on their socialization, on gender norms, and that's something that they hold for life. I can give you my own super quick example. A little girl growing up in northern India in a small town, deeply entrenched by deep patriarchal norms, didn't have voice or agency or even any kind of decision-making power in terms of what my life could be, my education, my marriage. And I have to tell you that that has really impacted my decisions in my entire life, how I stand up or not stand up for myself, how I did not stand up against the abuse, in my life. And while I was able to change that around, but that's a conversation for another day. Putting that in context today, young people are facing extremely complex, fast-changing world, which is really sort of impacted by climate change, crisis, conflict, social and political divide. So how do we change, that narrative around? I mean, young people are struggling to sort of grasp or hold on to something, that grounds them. So it's really important that we look at how are we working, with young people to sort of build them up and change, their narrative around, especially on gender equality. So our work at Girl Rising has really been about, working at the intersection of gender, youth, and social norm change. And we really sort of use storytelling to change the way young people think about themselves, change gender equality and perception for them, and really sort of build their life skills, their gender attitudes on how they can be leaders and, have aspirations for themselves, and then work with communities and also with local governments to be able to change the systems for lasting sort of impact. And what we've really learned is funders wouldn't really want to fund this, but we really need a very multi-sectoral approach for holistic development. So I'm going to go to this wonderful panel that I have here today, and I'm going to start with you, Maria. Your work with Outright International for a long time has been working on advocating for rights of LGBTQ and inclusion. Tell us, what are your, what are you still wrestling with, and what has really sort of helped with inclusive approaches in the government system?
Thank you. At Outright, we work for better LGBTIQ lives. And one thing that does not make anyone's life better is rigid gender norms. And first, I want to say, in the context that we live in now, I want to say that inclusive policies, they don't teach identities. They don't turn people into something that they're not. It's really about creating an inclusive environment where everyone can be themselves and be respected for who they are. And another thing I want to say at the start is that we know that facts are not enough to influence norms. But increasingly, we are seeing laws in countries that essentially ban information about LGBTIQ people, or non-traditional families, as it's often called, and don't get me started on what is considered an actual traditional family. But if you don't even have, if it's illegal for you to access the facts, then of course that's an institutional form of discrimination. The way that this translates in many situations is, of course, into bullying. So boys who are deemed too feminine, girls who are considered too masculine, they are bullied. And that does not only affect those who are being bullied, it affects everyone, because they learn they are being policed, that they have to conform to rigid gender norms or they will be punished. And so, in terms of what works, we all probably could take all of this time describing this, but I looked at what the UN independent expert on protection from violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. He published a report a few months ago on bullying. There are 3 things that stand out. Anti-bullying policies need to be explicit and include sexual orientation and gender identity. Teachers need training, because otherwise there is a risk that they are being silent, and that sort of gives the silent okay to the bullying. Or even worse, in some cases, they participate in enforcing gender norms. And third, there needs to be a confidential way of reporting, so that if you are reporting that you're being bullied, you should not be punished, you should not be outed as a result. And doing these things, it's not just good for LGBTIQ youth, it's really good for everyone. And I think that's the thing we need to get everyone to see, that if we don't enforce these rigid gender norms, it actually opens up for everyone.
Yeah, that is so true. I completely agree. And moving from inclusive policies, Meyrem, I would like to come to you, and we've been talking a lot about social media and the digital impact of it, and we're seeing how social media can fuel misogyny and roll back progress on equality, especially among young people. I'd love to hear from you and your experience on what is the right balance that we can strike between prevention, regulation, and also building resilience of adolescents online.
Thank you for the question. Maybe just to start, the reason I am here is because I feel a very strong need to tell everybody out there in Belgium and beyond that we are living in a very dangerous time. There is a real sense of urgency here. This is a ticking time bomb, social media, because the online world is influencing the offline world in a very deep, profound way. Democracy is under threat. And there is a saying by Gramsci that says, the old world is dying, and we have fought so hard to change that old world. We had successes. The new one is struggling to be born, and we're facing backlash on those successes that we've had. This is the time of the monsters. And there's an abundance of monsters, helped by algorithms on social media. And if social media were a country, they would have the size of a continent, and they would be dictatorships. Because there are no rules. It's the far west out there. And every possible form of prejudice is very much alive and kicking. And what I've seen in my years, I've been party president for 8 years. We've been a majority. I have had vice prime minister in Belgium who was a transgender, who was afraid to go to some places in the world as a vice prime minister. This was a very important person for us, I think in politics anyway. But what I've seen as a party president is that in the last few years, there are so much talented women who decided no longer to run. They said, if I look at all these comments that you get, all the other women's, every 30 seconds attacks on social media, this is not worth it. I don't want this. Everything starts there. We can talk about regulation all we want. But if people from queer minorities, women, young people say, I don't even want to start. How are we ever going to change politics? How are we ever going to regulate? How are we ever going to fight back? And this is the time to fight. So I'm deeply concerned. This is why I'm here. Because we need to regulate. We need regulators with teeth. We need young women to engage. We need to prevent, and we have all kinds of programs in Belgium, media-wise, so that you can identify when your emotions are being played as young adolescents. Really important. How to use social media. We have bans on cell phones on schools. But when school's out, no one knows what these children are confronted with. You have children's programs for children aged 4 or 5. And then you have the toxic versions of those same programs that are being pushed by YouTube when the parent is cooking. So this is quite incredible. It's happening in our households. So you have to engage in preventing, engaging, educating young people. You have to regulate. You have to have regulators with teeth. And you have to hold these social media platforms accountable because they are the megaphone for toxic norms, not just traditional norms, but toxic norms that are harmful for everyone. Women, young people, adolescents, and they are specifically being targeted because if a young woman no longer speaks out, then this voice is no longer there in our democratic realm, so you don't have to tackle the issues that they are dealing with in real life, offline. The violence that we experience every day, the gap in the labor market, those are no longer subjects that we discuss in Parliament because there will be less women. So their perspective will be absent. Same with queer people. And we see, I myself, I'm a member of a minority group being raised as a Muslim, Turkish second-generation migrant, that they are targeted even harder. So this intersectionality, we should not forget it. It's even worse if you belong to different minority groups. So there's a real fight there, and I'm very, very deeply concerned, and we have to fight back together, have a strategy on those 3 levels. First one, regulation. Second one, education. And third one, engaging, because we are not just victims. In the street, when you see a woman being harassed, we teach our children. I teach my friends. I myself, I intervene. I say, no, this cannot happen. I call the police. I intervene myself. This should happen online as well. We should learn, and I'm learning my 2 boys, 15, 18-year-old, you're not just a bystander. You have to speak out. And if we do this systematically, this can be a very strong force, and there's hope in that.
Thank you so much. And you know, all of this actually has such a deep impact on mental health and well-being of young people that we are talking about, something that is really not addressed deeply and that needs to be. So Dr. Alfiee, I'd come to you. Your work with the AAKOMA project has shown co-creating mental health interventions with girls and with gender-expansive communities, has been really sort of helping. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and what hope and confidence do you see in some of those strategies?
Yes. So first of all, thank you for making me go after these 2. My goodness. It really is a pleasure to be here. Takk fyrir to everybody who's been very supportive since I've been here in Iceland. And what I will say is 2 things. At the AAKOMA project, we have a set of principles that guide us. And I feel like those principles are very relevant for what my colleagues here have shared. We have 3 things that we really try to promote all the time with young people as it relates to mental health. And those things are, we want to raise consciousness. We want everybody to know that there's a space for them in conversations about mental health. We want to change the system of mental health. And we want to provide people with tools to help themselves. And so the idea is there's room for all of us in these conversations, not just in the United States, where I happen to be from, but globally, there is room for all of us. And too often, young people feel that there's no space for them in these conversations, as my colleagues shared, particularly when you have a marginalized identity. So at the AAKOMA project, we sit right in the center of conversations around what it means to have a marginalized identity, whether that's, and one thing I always love to say to people is our young people are not either this thing or that thing, right? They're not either LGBTQAI plus or a young person of color. They're not either a young person with a disability or a young person. They're all of those things together. And so our job is to make sure, as my colleague said when we opened, that we allow space for them to be all of who they are and for us to respect and value all of who they are. So one of the things I heard the president say when we were at the president's residence, I have to take a moment to say how wonderful it is to say, Madam President. That just gives me like so much energy, and I just love it. Hopefully one day we get to say that in the U.S. My soror and my fellow Howard University bison almost got there, but hopefully we're going to get there. So I think what I like to remind people of is that when you see, hear, and value someone, you give them space to really sort of emerge into all of who they are. Another thing that we like to say at the AAKOMA Project is our vision is that every young person, inclusive of all points of identity, feels the freedom to rise and thrive unapologetically and authentically as the best version of themselves. And what gets in the way of that is when we don't take care of or pay attention to their mental health or their emotional well-being. So what do we do to try to help with that? Part of what we do is we co-create with young people. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One example is in 2023 and then again in 2025, we created something called the State of Mental Health of Youth and Young Adults of Color. It is a research report grounded in, the first time it was about 1,600 young people. This time I'm so proud to say we had 8,651 young people in the United States participate in this survey. The other thing that I love about it is the young people, we have a group of, we call them leaders and advisors called Team, T-E-A-M, AAKOMA. Their job is to hold us accountable, to work with us on the questions that we pose to young people, the topics that we think about asking young people, and then to share the word about the data. Because their peers are going to be more invested when they hear it coming from somebody who looks like, talks like, thinks like them, rather than an old head like me. I'm Gen X, right? They don't want to hear it from me. I have 2 kids. I know they don't want to hear it from me. And so in doing that, what we're doing is, I call it service-based learning, right? That terminology has been out there. I did not make it up. But what we're doing is demonstrating that young people have a voice. Not only do you have a voice, but you are empowered to use that voice. So when we talk about empowerment at the AAKOMA Project, what I talk about with people is it is about you embodying the power that already exists within you. It is not about somebody giving you something and they're losing something by giving over power. So that's a part of what we do. The other thing that I want to say quickly about our data is that those of us in the room, data heads, I know you're in here, we tend to lean back and rely on what we call representative samples. When you do representative sampling, what are you missing, right? So if you're only looking for if this population of people represents 1% of whatever country you're from, you're going to get 1% of that sample. But that's not telling you the rich diversity of who's in that 1%. So what we do is we search for equitable samples. And I have to say this really quickly. The difference for me between equality and equity, I think what I really want us to focus on is equity. Because when you have equity, everybody gets what they need to be successful. Versus equality, everybody's getting the same thing. Yeah. And what that person has might not be what I need to be successful. So when I just think about how we talk to our young people about taking care of their mental health, I feel like not only are we talking with them, we are providing tools that not only help them in the moment for the work that they do with us, but it helps them to carry that message out into their communities for parents and caregivers, people who look like them, people who don't. So the final thing I'll say is this, quickly. In 2024, Melinda French Gates named me one of the 12 global leaders with a $20 million fund. Part of what we also do in that work is I learn from the young people that we work with who are people out there in the world doing good work with nonprofits, working with or maybe they're fiscally sponsored, so that we can pour into those folks. So it's not just the folks that everybody knows globally who get the money. It is people in community with trust, people in community with cultural cachet, people who are actually doing the work. So that's some of how we try to do what we do around mental health.
Great, thank you. And I know that we are totally running out of time, while there are so many other issues that we need to really sort of wrestle with, especially when we talk about young people. But I'm just going to go around and maybe 10 seconds, while we have only 10 seconds, just one rule that you would want this room of leaders to rethink.
That's the anti-trans narratives that are being used everywhere in the world right now. We are the ones who have to fight back, because there's nothing to it. If you want to come talk to me afterwards, please do. But we are the ones who need to stand up against that.
Yeah.
Well, on a local level, I think we have to build programs that engage young people in being an actor online. And at the national level, we really have to hold these platforms accountable for the kinds of messages they are spreading, so that they pay for every time that we have to put up programs that try to fix what they have ruined. So,
Dr. Alfiee.
So I'm just remembering, I'm going to get it wrong, so y'all can correct me later, but I remember from last night, the film that we watched, when they talked about this idea of first they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you get angry or something like that, and then you win, right?
Yeah.
And so I want us to be in the mindset of this is the part where people are getting angry and rageful, which means we have an opportunity to push forward and to win, and I believe we will do that.
Great. I will just end with one last word on, I think I heard in the earlier session this morning where Martin said something that he was brought up in a very gender equitable home, an environment, that really sort of led him to live the life that he lived, very inspiring. And millions of girls and boys around the world do not have that. So I would really sort of end with saying that please invest in youth, in young people, because we see that gender norm change work really works. We see young people, parents, teachers, leaders changing every day. So do not give up hope on them, and please invest in them. Thank you.